let me go ahead and get started. And thank you so much for those that are sharing where you're from. My name is Sean Smith. I'm from the University of Kansas here in Lawrence, Kansas. As we get started here, I thought I'd introduce not only CIDDL, but what we'll be doing here for the next hour. Feel free to use the chat to introduce yourself, as well as to post questions. And of course, we have the question and answer tool as well within Zoom to do that as well. And I'll remind you of that in just a moment. But for those of you unfamiliar with CIDDL, this is a center funded by the Office of Special Education Programs of the U.S. Department of Education. It's called the Center for Innovation, Design, and Digital Learning. It's a collaboration between the University of Kansas, University of Central Florida, and CAST. And our focus, of course, is to support related service, special education, early childhood, leadership, all development in respect to technology and innovation. And we thought we'd kick off our first webinar on the focus of within that same preparation of future related service personnel, special educators, early childhood educators, and leadership in supporting learner variability, particularly in the UDL application and implications for teacher preparation. Today we have with us, and what we're going to focus on today is a format with some phenomenal panelists. We're going to get a chance to be introduced to them in just a moment. And so the format will be really just an interactive conversation from these experts that will introduce themselves in just a moment. And as I mentioned a moment ago, I want to make sure that you are very comfortable. I'll be facilitating this interaction and we'll be asking some questions, but I want to hear from you via the chat and or the question function of the Zoom about questions you might have. And now I'll interject those and weave those into the conversation over this brief hour. And since it's very brief, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to ask for Dr. Basham to begin the introductions, and then we'll go alphabetical from there. So go ahead there, Dr. Basham.
Thanks, Sean. Hi, everyone. I'm Jamie Basham, professor at the University of Kansas. I'm also Senior Director of Learning Innovation at CAST, as well as, one of the principal investigators here at CIDDL. So do I hand it off to someone? Or?
Alphabetical. So Elisa will go next.
Elisa.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I don't normally look like this. I teach my undergraduate class this morning and we were doing social and leisure skills. So for transition, so we were doing some community activities related to participating in the community for Halloween. So I'm just sorry. So Cruella will be on today. I'm at the University of Mississippi and I am a professor there and I work with primarily teachers who work with students with more significant disabilities and in the area of UDL and inclusive classrooms.
Dr. Marino.
Thank you, Cruella. That was an excellent introduction. I'm Matt Marino from the University of Central Florida. I'm a professor of exceptional education, which is what we call special education in Florida. And my area of expertise is working with secondary students with high incidence disabilities in STEM related fields.
And last but not least, Dr. Kavita.
Hello, my name is Kavita Rao, and I am a professor at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And Elisa, I love your idea of coming to webinars with an alter ego. I might have to do that from now on. My areas of research and work are in technology, UDL, culturally and linguistically diverse students, and online learning. So those are just some of the ways that I tie in UDL together.
Well, great. And so I'm excited about this. So, oh, and by the way, I'm also a co-principal investigator in CIDDL here as also a professor in special education, as I mentioned, at the University of Kansas. And I'm just delighted to be here as the facilitator. And I just want to say, I think it's just, Elisa, the way you are coming to this is so representative of who you are as a teacher educator. So I'm delighted. So let's get started here, folks. And as mentioned earlier, with our overall focus with the center, you know, in terms of how we are working with future related service, early childhood, special education, and leaders in our field, this idea as we prepare these future individuals within the use of the UDL framework, I guess my first question, and I'd like to direct this to begin with Kavita, and then of course everyone else jump in, but what are some of the essential elements or the precursors needed to facilitate the adoption and or implementation of the Universal Design for Learning framework? I'll repeat that again. What are some of the essential elements or precursors needed to facilitate the adoption and or implementation of the Universal Design for Learning framework within our efforts for our future educators?
Okay, Sean, since you tagged me for the first question, I'll jump
Great.
in saying that for me, something I learned as an essential element is before you start going into UDL, teaching about UDL, talking about UDL, is first setting up why inclusion. And this is, I'll just tell you a personal story. I was doing a lot of teacher training and professional development on UDL, and I'd go in and like I'd have the framework, I'd talk about the multiple means, I'd go into how great it was. And then I started realizing, wait, if you don't set up why you're doing all of this, the framework is just looks like a bunch of not meaningless, it looks like a bunch of strategies. So these days I step back and I start first with setting up that value for inclusion, because UDL is all about inclusive practices for all learners. And I think setting up that value also helps teachers from whatever, or teachers or related service personnel or whoever is you're working with when you're doing these trainings. It helps everybody get on the same page that UDL is for all, and then also why we're doing this, rather than just here's another framework, here's something more to do. So again, I think my short answer is first setting up why inclusion. Anybody else want to expand on that, riff off of that?
I would say that you also need a predisposition for flexibility, because when we're offering courses using UDL and modeling UDL, things can go in 5 different directions at once. And you have to be prepared to go with the students in those directions and meet them where they are. And so I find that to be incredibly challenging at times, especially when I'm working with undergraduate students and I'm not familiar with their language as much as I used to be when I was 20 years younger. And so they may be talking about something and I, in my head, am just trying to interpret what it is that they actually mean.
So I'll just add to that and say that I have a little bit of what both Kavita and Matt said, in that I have philosophy of inclusion written down, that you have to believe that, inclusive practices are necessary. And then I have that you have to understand student variability, that need for flexibility, that need for meeting students where they are, and that need for setting up a classroom environment that reaches all of that variability and being flexible in what you put forward as you design your classroom and your instruction. So I think that is both what Kavita said and what Matt said. So I'm glad we're all on the same page there.
I guess the last thing I would say is, and to add to all of it, because I would agree with all of my colleagues here, is that it's not one practice. It's not a thing, right? It's not like we often talk about, especially in special education, the evidence-based practice, and we're working on evidence-based practice. Well, UDL is a process. And it's about implementing that framework in that process. And that's one of the essential elements to think about, that it's the integration of multiple practices. So you will use what we often consider evidence-based, research-based, or even high leverage practices in the implementation of UDL, but it's not something you just, to one of our former colleagues who just passed away, Joy Zavala, who used to say, you don't do UDL, that it's actually an implementation process.
It's interesting. I asked a question about what are, and that was excellent responses, but we also got into a little bit of the why, which I think is very relevant. And I asked us to continue coming back to that why, because as we know, there are many in the field that are, yes, very much aligned with the implementation and the use of the framework, but also still others are asking why. And so I'll leave that one there while I ask a more specific question. And that is, so as we try to, implement some of these elements, et cetera, what are some of the challenges? And of course, within our world of the UDL framework, potential barriers in our efforts, in our teacher education, et cetera, efforts. And then this is open to anyone. I won't pick on anyone, right? As long as someone jumps in first. So there you go. Some challenges and or barriers.
I'll jump in with a challenge that relates to the flexibility I was discussing earlier, and that's time. So when you have a UDL-based curricula, you need to be prepared to have students who are completing an assessment, and they may complete it 7 different ways. And it's not as fast as if you're going to, for example, assess someone in a 5-page paper, right? It's not like everybody's submitting the 5-page paper. You have 5 different projects that are coming to you that take different amounts of time for you to evaluate. And hopefully you were smart enough to set up a rubric ahead of time so that they actually have some objectives that they're going to. But I would say that that is the major limitation in my world.
You want to go in reverse order?
Doesn't matter. Don't be shy. Don't be shy. Jump in. Elisa, go ahead.
So I jotted down a few things since I knew I was coming from class. And the first one has to do with what we were talking about earlier. And that is when people say inclusion, but don't mean inclusion. So we have a lot of people who talk about having an inclusive mindset when they start into UDL, but don't really mean everybody and don't really mean equal participation. So I've defined that in a couple of ways. It's a barrier when you continue having prerequisites for access, which inclusion is not about that. It's a barrier when you continue segregating within classroom environments. So you have a classroom environment, but you have the guys in the back that aren't really participating in anything that's going on in the rest of the classroom. And it can be a barrier when you fall back on those traditional methodologies, which I find myself doing occasionally as a post-secondary person. Just, when there is no other answer, we go back to what we've always done, or when we can't come up with an answer. And so to me, that's a barrier. I think another barrier is that what Jamie said so well, Dr. Basham said so well, which is that thinking of UDL as a practice instead of a process. So you get kind of bogged down in the strategies sometimes, and there's sometimes disagreement when you're in an inclusive classroom about using those evidence-based strategies that we know work for students with disabilities, but are so different sometimes than how general educators may have been prepared. And then finally, I think a real barrier, and if you know me, you won't be surprised by this, is being afraid to question or articulate when something isn't working. We kind of, UDL can kind of be sold as a philosophy sometimes, and people have a hard time talking about what doesn't work without sounding like they're bashing the philosophy or the framework. And we have to be critical because of the students that we're serving. So I think we need to be better in education as a whole of saying, this is working, this is not working. That doesn't mean we're throwing it all out. It just means we're trying to work on what's working in our particular situation or what is not working. So being real about what's going on with UDL, I think, is really important.
I think that's really kind of spot on, actually. I think the other thing that makes it kind of difficult is, I think the human way of trying to understand something is to categorize it, right? And so that oftentimes when we're working with pre-service educators or even graduate level educators, they want to understand the practice, and that's what makes it kind of difficult. They want to understand things like, what box can I put this into? And one of the things that when we work on this, like teaching a structural strategies course now, practices course, which is rooted in UDL, one of the things for them to come to understand, there's not going to be you can't just look up this thing and do this thing and then it's always going to work with all these students. And so it's a different way to educate people, and that makes it difficult, because what we're really asking them to do is really take on design-based thinking and really look at what's the goal that you're trying to accomplish, what are the various ways in which you can accomplish this goal, and how do you do this not with just one student, but the whole group of students that you're trying to educate. And then how do we gather meaningful data to see whether it worked or not, to Elisa's point, right? And then how do we iterate or modify as needed around that? And that's something, I think, a new way of thinking about what teachers need in the future is to think in that sort of process sort of way versus, I think the traditional way of thinking about teacher education, and this is going to sound terrible, and Elisa might beat me up on it because she occasionally catches me on these things, but I don't mean it in such a way, but historically, I think teachers have often been prepared as factory line workers, and they're not at all. In fact, they're very much designers of the environment. And we just need to really think about what it takes to become a designer of the environment. And to do that, in my mind, is we have to think about what other sort of professions do, right? What do architects do? What do engineers do? What do designers learn, and how do they learn that trait? And we need to embed that sort of critical thinking and problem solving and everything into our teacher education system. And what's difficult now is that that's not really true. That's not truly written into the knowledge and skills that we always recognize, right? It's not always in the red book, if you would, from CEC. I know there's a new red book now. Maybe it's in there now, but I think that makes it difficult. So
I'll jump in. I'm going to zoom out a little bit, macro out on a barrier that I see, and then I'm going to go deeper into some of the things and corroborate what all my colleagues here have said. So zooming out, one big barrier I find in the work that I do is the conception that UDL is a special ed thing, and just breaking that down, that it is not a special ed thing. It is an all education thing, and all educators, teachers, related service folks are responsible for delivering instruction for our students. And so I think because UDL came from way back when, from the Center for Applied Special Technology, there was that notion that it's a special ed thing. But I think over the last 2 or 3 decades, UDL really has been conceptualized as Jamie said, a design framework that really makes instruction more flexible and engaging for all learners. So UDL gets pushback from 2 places. So sometimes we get a general ed pushback that this is for special educators to do. We get special ed pushback saying this is not interventions that work for our special ed kids. But there is a middle ground there, because UDL can set up the environment and the learning activities to be more inclusive for all. You may still need to do additional interventions. UDL does not take out the need to do the interventions that you need to do for some students. And UDL is not going to work for everybody all the time, but it's just a matter, you're just designing things to become more flexible, as Matt said at the very beginning, and just creating more flexible, supportive learning environments for all. So for me, that's one of the biggest barriers to get past, this idea that it's not my thing, or I'm not the person responsible for doing UDL. My second point to this, I'm actually going to try to address a question that Sandy asked in the chat box, and I'm
Thank you, Kavita. Yeah, I was going to
so Sandy asked, so is UDL is best described as an implementation process and not a set of strategies or the we do UDL mentality? So that is Sandy's question, and it's perfect because it was what I was going to say for the barriers. I think one of the misconceptions is that, oh, I already do these things. These are a bunch of differentiation strategies. And yes, absolutely. If you look at the framework, if you read those checkpoints, those look like things that many teachers do. That's what, we train people in personnel prep programs, teacher licensure programs. However, what UDL does is bring all those strategies together, and then it asks you to think about using those strategies meaningfully. So sometimes I'll have people tell me, oh, I already do that multiple means of representation thing. But I'm like, okay, that's not telling me how you're meaningfully including students, how you're meaningfully using those strategies to build in supports and flexibility for the learners in your classroom, for the variability of your classroom. So I think we're going to go into design more in the next few questions, but I think to me, that's one of the biggest, the misconception that the framework is just giving you a bunch of random strategies to throw into instruction is one of the barriers that I think we have to overcome with UDL.
Now, panelists, remember, you can jump back in. It's just not one shot at the question. And I actually have a follow-up to this. And you all alluded to elements of this. So I want to continue with this challenge and barrier. And so where I want to go with the question, though, is the following. Oftentimes, depending upon where we receive our future, educators, and that education reference is very broad: early childhood related service, special education, our future leaders, et cetera. Depending upon where they are as learners and depending upon where they are in the career, they could be very much aligned with, well, I like to call, sadly, a couple of my children the NCLBers. they were no child left behind. I have a student who's just starting her master's degree, and a child who's just starting her master's degree, just graduated from undergraduate, and she is definitely an NCLBer. She was very much reinforced that way. And then when she got to college, her first several years of college were reinforced that way in that traditional type of instruction. So not only have we been discussing in your introductions the fact that we're trying to facilitate an understanding of the framework, but many of you alluded with your examples that you are instructing through the implementation of the framework, which is an uncomfortable place for many of our learners. I'm wondering if you could address that and a potential challenge or barrier in not only introducing the framework, but modeling that aspect to students that potentially have been reinforced over years of something that's a little bit more traditional and very much not aligned with the framework. So don't all need to jump in there, but many of you alluded to it.
That's a great point, Sean. I just like to reiterate this from a slightly different angle, because what I found, and this gets to something that Elisa brought up earlier, and Jamie did too, about design-based thinking. And we're trying to teach our pre-service teachers to become designers. But when I provide them with assessment options, they choose the one they're most comfortable with. So I may have a multiple choice quiz that's a legacy quiz that was built, 10 years ago, and it's still in the module because I built it 10 years ago in the module. And I will have 80% of my students choose to take that multiple choice quiz as opposed to doing some of the other assessment options that we put in there as flexibility. I'd like to know from the rest of the panel what they do to address that resistance.
I think acknowledging that resistance is a real answer to what Sean was asking, related to the fact that we have so many students who have come up through a rigid system at the post-secondary level. And when I supply flexibility, I have the same thing, Matt. So if I supply flexibility in assessment, which I always do now, I have a lot of people who will choose within that traditional assessment grouping. So it may be that you select you build your own tests, so to speak. I use that a lot. And then for essays, they can either have videos where they talk into record what they're going to do or write. But I've also I also have some choices where a traditional measure is not one of the choices. So it's basically a forced choice of, one comes to mind where they either have to create a PSA in social media, they have to do an interview. So the rubric's the same across for all assignments. There are 3 different assignments that they can choose from, but they're all very different, even though they come to the same idea, which is learning more about a specific disability and the impact on family. So yeah, I have that same issue. We can be flexible, but we do have learners who do prefer traditional methods. And I have to remind myself that if that's truly your preference, it's okay, right? I mean, I would probably pick those things as well. So, but a lot of that has to do with our learning and experience in our education system, as Sean was saying. So Kavita may have more to add on that.
Well, one thing I do, especially with my pre-service teachers, is have them reflect on the choices they make. And then I do different exercises so that we kind of listening to each other's reflections and, riffing off of, oh, just because you like that choice doesn't mean everybody else does. And then when people reflect on why they chose the traditional assessment, they can see. So just, I do that. I do kind of self-reflection as a way to give pre-service teachers or even in-service teachers a way to think about how different people might need different assessments. I do also want to emphasize, though, one of the things that I'm really big on is that UDL is not just about providing options. It's not just about providing 3 ways to do something. And I see everybody nodding because we are all design people. So the options you provide should be related to the goal of your lesson, your learning experience, whatever it is. So sometimes it's not helpful to provide options. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. Sometimes, as I think Elisa said, you might do 2 options and take out one of them. So again, the options provided really should be about the demonstration of understanding related to your goal. Sometimes giving too many options can actually be confounding to students because they're like, how do I choose and which one, so again, I think I just want to emphasize that because we're talking about providing options with assessments, but even those should be done with a design thinking lens.
So
Absolutely.
Kavita,
I
is
want
there
to
a
add
met-
to the, oh, sorry.
Go ahead,
Matt.
Lisa, you add, and then Jamie, you follow. Go ahead, Lisa.
I think that was Matt, actually.
Yeah, I was just going to ask a follow-up question, but go ahead, Elisa. I'll
Yeah,
follow
go
up
ahead.
after you.
Well, I was just going to say that in my design, one of the things, I mean, I come from a severe disabilities background and we use controlled choice a lot. And so I think about that a lot in terms of what is my learning target and what choices may I offer there. But I mean, also design for me, I think the bigger challenge for me has to do with how I present material, because it's so easy just to do it the traditional methodology way, right? Just throw up your notes or your PowerPoint or whatever and do that. And I have to force myself as an old dog, so to speak, to really redesign my instruction so that, yeah, I show up to class as Cruella or whatever because of the topic. It's not just Halloween, it was also the topic that we were talking about today, community involvement. And so, I have to do that as well, not just options for students, but options for instruction or redesign for instructional targets.
Matt, you had a follow-up, and then Jamie?
Well, I just want to say I really wish I was in Elisa's class today.
Yeah, me
And
too.
I'm sorry that I missed that. But when Kavita was talking about, it's not just about presenting, an immeasurable number of options. I'm wondering if you guys have a general rule of thumb, how many options you would present. From my perspective, 3 seems to be the best number, or the one that works, I should say, in my classes most often. But I'm just wondering what other folks think, because as you start setting up a UDL classroom, you've got to start somewhere, right? And I'm wondering if you guys have a magic number. So Kavita, I'll go back to you since you're the one who started my thought on that first.
Okay, so I'm going to say I strongly feel there is no magic number. It should be related to your goal. So you might have a lesson goal where 3 is great, and you might have a lesson goal where this one might need 1 or 2. So again, I guess that's just that's my conception of the design part of it, where your number of options really depends on what you're doing. There are things where you might actually want to assess it one way because the construct is partly what you're assessing. Can you write this? Or there might be other things where it doesn't matter how it's done. So you give them options. So again, I tend to not be I don't quantify this, but Matt, where I do think as a starting point, you want to start, it's the methods, it's the instructional methods, which is what Elisa was talking about, where I would give more options. So assessments to me are really tied to the goals, but in the methods, try to be flexible in at least like a couple, 3 ways. And, one thing that people find once they start doing UDL, designing with UDL, is that once you start doing a few things, they start meeting several of the UDL guidelines and checkpoints. So it's pretty easy to add several flexibilities into a lesson when you start doing one thing. So I guess that's my short answer, Matt, is that I would look more at the methods and instructional strategies being where you try to put in 2, 3 options, not focus so much on the assessments. And I'm curious what you think of that, Matt.
I think that's a great non-answer.
That's funny.
Jamie, you're going to jump in?
Of course he's going to jump in. Go ahead, Dr. Basham.
I'm really uncomfortable with people call me Dr. Basham on this call, but I think it's an interesting sort of thing. I've just learned, well, there's a couple of things I want to back up actually to the original, and then I'll answer the new one. But I always in working with teachers across the country on implementation in the classroom, and then trying to model that in the way we prepare educators and related service personnel for that matter. What I learned is that to talk to them, really to have them understand why and how they're making choices, to develop really that metacognitive sort of understanding. And one of the things that kind of came to me is I was working with a teacher, I think in Montgomery County, Maryland, and what they said to me is the first thing they learned was that if they design their class so that they can get through it successfully, and they can get through every single route successfully and through all the different options successfully, then they've designed it for really one person, themselves. And so I kind of thought, well, that's kind of neat to think about. So I encourage my students to really think in that sort of way. And in doing so, I've also encouraged them to take on new ways of learning. And I think that's one way to do it. To Matt's earlier question, the other thing I learned in working in the field with teachers on this is I always give at least two to three choices, whether I'm dealing with obviously the engagement part, representation, or action expression. I really give 2 to 3 choices, but I always give a choice to say, if you want to try something different that's not listed here, let us know. It simply has to be made accessible for us. And what's amazing about that in the, I don't know, 10 or 11 years or so, I've been working even with undergrads and graduate students on implementing UDL and as a model. What's amazing to me is there's not been one semester that hasn't gone by where a student, bachelor student, master's student, even doc student, that hasn't said to me, this is the first time in my entire academic career that I've able to actually show what I know. Now think about that. We're talking about the upper, 15, 10, 5% of the population from a academic or educational sort of stance. And these students are saying, for the first time in my entire career in the classroom, I'm able to finally show what I know, because I've had the option to take on different ways. And that has always been moving to me. And we get one of those or so every semester that we just get a by the way. And I think that's just a meaningful thing for us to think about, because when we're designing really for the students, the students that are not in that sort of upper quartile, what's it mean for the rest of the students? And that's a meaningful sort of position to take, I think.
May
So-
I add something, Sean?
Go ahead, Elisa. Go ahead, please.
So I agree with everything. Everyone has such great insights. And I just wanted to say that I often think of it, I do provide a lot of options, but Matt, there's no magic. I completely agree with Kavita that there's no magic number, but I will say that when I'm designing my assessments or my measures of progress throughout the semester, I try to think of it from a perspective of a student being able to tailor it to their interests or to their either in how they respond. So they have some choice in how they respond, or they have some choice in what they respond with, meaning they can either use their own personal experience and their own personal interest within their practica, for example, or they can tailor how they actually give that back to me, or maybe both. But everything I do, I try now very hard to make sure, I think of it as tailor making those things so that you have some option in how you tailor your project or your assessment. And it's not a magic number. If I have something that doesn't have options in it or doesn't allow the student to at least write about a student or a situation that they're interested in educationally through whatever the target may be, as Kavita said, if we're talking about, creating a behavior intervention plan or whatever, then I go back and rework that assignment or redesign that assignment to include some of those tailor-making pieces within it. That's all, Sean. Sorry.
That's great. Go ahead, Kavita. It looks like you want to jump in.
Yeah, I was thinking of something, and I think, Elisa, you put words to it. One thing to think about is also the formative and summative assessments. So I think there's a summative assessments. How many do you want to provide? Again, sometimes you're stuck with a summative that like your grade level team has given you or the IB has given you. You have to do this summative assessment. So sometimes the flexibility is in the formative assessments, how you get students to succeed in the summative. So that's another reason why I tend to not go with numbers, because sometimes it might be externally mandated what the assessment is, but what you want to use UDL through the methods and the formative to get students to be able to succeed on that format that they're given. So again, I think there's and also because it's a design framework, it can be applied to so many levels. It can be preschool, elementary, high school, post-secondary, and the way you assess may be different depending on the level, the goal, what it is. So again, just putting it out there to think about I think the formative is actually so key for UDL, because that's where you can actually support students. You can see how they're doing and give them flexibility, and then give them the scaffolds necessary to master whatever it is you're doing. I hope that's more of an answer, Matt.
Oh, I agree with you 100%, Kavita. One of the challenges that we find, especially in Florida, is that our teachers, our special education teachers, are going to have to take that special education exam for their state level certification, right? So I kind of feel like if I'm not at least providing sample questions throughout the course to prep them for that, then we're going to have low passing rates, which means the dean is going to call me and want to discuss why we have low passing rates, right? And so it's really important that while you're going through and you're using UDL, doing UDL, right, as as you're designing, you're coming up with ways to actually get back to the summative assessment that the students are going to have to take.
But isn't that one of the important points that oftentimes we see? This is more of a commentary. I do want to follow up on another question, but oftentimes some of the resistance I think we hear from our colleagues in the implementation of the framework is that, wait, we have our standards we need to abide by, and providing too much flexibility, options, et cetera, we're not going to actually get to instruction and or measurement of what they will then be assessed on. And so I like how, Matt, you basically gave us an illustration, an example of the fact that, wait, in your own learning and implementation of the framework, you're abiding by the same types of structure and you're seeing the success. So that was more of a commentary comment. We've been at this now for, oh my gosh, about 40 minutes. It's amazing how quickly an hour goes. So with the 20 minutes we have left, let's get into, I'm going to start with a question in the chat, and I want to kind of enhance upon that. But this question goes along with, and thank you, Sandy, for sharing it. How do we get started? And I guess I'd like to expand upon how we get started to what are some potential successful strategies or methods or ways. And many of you already alluded to this, and you've offered some examples, but let's continue down that way of bringing this into what we're trying to do and what successful ways you've done it. So either how you get started for those that newbies and or ways that you've continued to integrate. So love to hear from anybody and everyone.
I'll jump in on this one for starters. So both Sandy and then Sarah also asked about learner variability in the Q&A. So this is a big question here. So one of the things I do, I teach a 16-week course as a technology and UDL course for pre-service teachers. And I realized I spend my first 2 weeks on learner variability because that is the most important thing. That's what you got to get at. And one of the things I've learned, it's an exercise. I've created a graphic where I got learner variability in the middle, and then I put variability includes student needs, student abilities and strengths. That's really important. Students' backgrounds and experiences, and students' preferences. So I kind of make this like just this visual showing that variability is a lot of things, including support needs, but also abilities and who they are, where they come from, what they know. And then what I do is different exercises depending on the groups I'm teaching. So if I'm with pre-service teachers who may not have as much experience in the classroom, I have my students throw out their variability and we build out the chart so they can see just in those 20 people, what are the variability factors? If I'm working with teachers with experience, I have them throw out the general variability they've seen in their classrooms over the years. And so that is, and I think one thing people start to see is that variability is systematic and predictable. This is something CAST has put out there in their UDL books. It is. I mean, so a lot of variability in a classroom is predictable. Of course, in every classroom, you're going to have some things that are specific and unique to that 30 students that you have. But if people start to see that variability is something that you can, it's basically just doing brainstorming exercises. One thing I explain to teachers is you don't have to get to know every student before you can start knowing what variability is, because some of those things will be kind of predictable. So that's just one strategy that I use.
I just want to interrupt real quick, folks. We do have some resources we've put together, and resources like Kavita, what she just shared, we will be asking for that resource as well. You've got several chats already asking for that. And we will put that together, and you'll get within 24 hours, 24 to 48 hours, a follow-up with those resources, as well as direct connections to us as presenters, et cetera. So sorry for the interruption, but wanted to get to those questions. So jump in, folks. I know I interrupted.
Well, where to get started, and then I tried to answer Sarah's question as well, which came in on the Q&A. Start with the goals, right? Always kind of what are goals we're trying to hit, and then when we work with educators in the K-12 world, we often think about the basics, like are things accessible? Or is everyone engaged? That sort of thing. And I think in some ways we have to do the same thing in the courses that we teach. We have to think about, is the content accessible? Are the students engaged? But then we're also trying to develop their meta level sort of understanding, which is to get them to understand the learning process and how what we're doing in the class is related to supporting learning, not only for them, but how then if we're modeling it, then we would be able to they would be able to carry that through in their classes. So we're taking that extra step. Oftentimes, as UDL is focused on developing really what we call expert learners, which is generically, can the person go off and learn? Do they understand their own learning? And how do we develop people to take on that sort of process throughout their life, which is a goal-driven learning? And so when our teachers leave our program, do they understand that they're not only educating students, but they're themselves learners, and they're continuing to go through that learning process? And so we have to teach them those things. And so we begin by even having conversations with them. I always start every class by telling the students, even undergrads, like, hey, you've come throughout, you've done a lot in your life, and you've always thought about yourself as a student. I don't want to think of you as students any longer. I want to have you think about yourself as young professionals. And what does it mean to be a professional in our field? And how do I then develop those things within you? And how do you recognize those things? So we do a lot of sort of reflective sort of understanding. And I do a lot of think alouds when I'm teaching, like, okay, why am I doing this? What's going on? And having them kind of get some connections. And then in from a modeling stance, I have them do things like, I want a rubric that you complete on yourself every time you submit an assignment, and tell me why you're giving yourself this rating. And then I come back to say, okay, why did we complete rubrics on ourselves? And have them kind of come to that understanding. How would you do this in your classroom, whether it's a fourth grade classroom or whether you're going to be a science teacher? I think these are things, and we just think about these little bitty sort of pieces that we build up.
Others in respect to getting started and or kind of successful solution strategies to integrate the framework in what you've done. And again, I know we've all alluded to it, but if you want to be specific, that would be awesome.
Matt, you want to go?
I can, sure. So I want to reiterate Kavita's idea of identifying the student's strengths at the very beginning, because I think that's a key to variability. I was working with a young lady who's in middle school the other day, and she has a terrible time taking tests, but the tests that she's getting from her teacher are all multiple choice tests. And this is in a middle school civics class. So she's having difficulty trying to organize the different types of governments and then the different types of leaders and power transitions that occur. And she happened to share with me a digital picture that she had drawn that was absolutely amazing artwork. And so I said to her, why don't we take and start making graphic organizers that you will design and draw digitally to represent the content that you need to know for this test? And it won't be in the same format, but it might help your memory as you try to recall what these things are, because you'll have the visual image in your brain. And I thought that was a really powerful tool that we don't necessarily teach to our teachers to teach to their students, right? So this student's teacher had never taught her to use her strengths as a way to learn the content. And I think we need to be doing that, just like Jamie was saying, with our own students in order for them to pass that along.
I agree. And if I can jump in here, I'd like to add from a more, well, not more practical, but I am incredibly practical in what I do. And I just want to say that variability, as Kavita said, that to me, that is the place you start, because multiple means of whatever component we're talking about doesn't matter to someone unless they understand that the group of students they're addressing has high variability. And so even at the post-secondary level, that goes back to that reason why. Why do you do this? You have to understand that the learners come to you with all kinds of needs for flexibility in instruction in order to understand the need for those multiple means of representation, action, expression, all of that. So we spend, particularly in one class that I teach with pre-service undergraduate teachers, we spend the first few weeks just on variability. And I start very much like Kavita, but a little bit different. So I use the Todd Rose pieces, particularly the TED Talk where he talks about the pilot thing. And in that TED Talk, there's a sketch of two human beings. It's just a graph and it shows variability across different tasks and activities. So I have basically a gingerbread man cut out that everyone graphs their own variability onto. And so we start by that, and then we do a little comparison contrast. It's kind of a fun thing to do, but we do a little comparison contrast, and that helps them see that within that room, there is marked variability. We can see that variability when you start looking at your gingerbread man. So I know that sounds very first gradish, and I'm actually a secondary teacher, but it helps them to see it. It makes it really visual for them. And then the rest of my time I spend, this is a disclaimer. I started out by saying my field is really about inclusive education, and I'm looking for those things that support students with more significant disabilities. So a lot of the rest of my time in terms of design is supporting pre-service teacher education in their design, whether it be their lesson planning, their unit planning, IEP planning, whatever it is, instructional planning, to incorporate those evidence-based practices that fit nicely. As Kavita said, we can predict some of that variability. So we know that certain evidence-based practices are going to be useful in any classroom. Things like visuals, that's going to be helpful, like what Matt was saying with graphic organizers. That's going to be helpful as an option in almost any classroom, or as a support in almost any classroom. Setting up your environment so that it's accessible and so that everybody can use that environment. Those are things that I have like a list of strategies. And it's not, Sean's going to say you need to share it. It's in my head, Sean, that I usually work on. And systematic instruction is one of those, because that's not really a strategy that most general education teachers come out with in terms of being able to incorporate that within a more constructivist model. So being able to switch back and forth or use that intentionally when needed, those are things that I incorporate in my classroom. And then the other thing is just challenging my flippin' self. I mean, the truth is, as an instructor, just trying to model multiple means of everything and trying to explain. So I go a little bit past that, I guess, in that when I do something like my assessment class just did a self-grading midterm where they had to grade their own midterm and they had to color code it and all this kind of stuff. But when I do that, trying to explain the why, right? Why did I design it in this way? And sometimes I miss. And that's the part that I go back to, that ability to say, this didn't work very well. So let's talk about that, and let's talk about why. Because I think it's really important as a teacher to model error. I mean, not to make errors on purpose, but when you do something that doesn't work, to really reflect on that. And so the other things that I think are really important that all the panelists have said is this idea of reflection, both as a group and independently, so that you continue to build your knowledge of yourself as a learner, but also your knowledge of yourself as a designer, because not everything works well, and especially for our pre-service teachers, they have these beautiful, I call them the Pinterest lessons, the beautiful Pinterest lesson. And then they go to do it and it doesn't work well. But if you don't debrief and go through those design elements that didn't work or that didn't reach everybody, they're not going to get to that iterative process. So to Kavita's point, that formative instruction of really going through and reflecting on and reworking, that design process is critically important. And just as a real practical measure, where to start, I always start with myself, how I design my lessons. Do I have multiple means of everything? Am I really modeling UDL in how I teach? So that's where I start, is with my own design.
We are running out of time, and
sorry.
No, awesome. This is a wealth of information. I know we're all saying to ourselves, okay, wait, I want to take a class with Kavita and that seminar with Elisa. And then of course, then go on to Matt and Jamie. And as CIDDL, we need to further figure out how to make sure that we highlight some of these things going forward. But with that said, I want to offer just a brief commentary to some of the things I just heard, and then ask one last question with our limited time. And thank you, Reagan, so much for giving an illustration of some of the things you're doing there in your inclusionary class. But one of the things I heard, I just want to reflect on, actually two elements I want to reflect on. One is oftentimes, I think within the field of teacher development, we talk about the needs to integrate high leverage practices, integrate elements of evidence-based practices. And then people start talking about the framework and say, well, it's not a practice, it's a framework, and how do you integrate? Well, I think all of us here, I'm not include myself, our panelists, basically share with examples of how they're integrating in things that we know are high leverage and effective for our students with disabilities that our future educators need to implement, and we're doing it within the framework. So I thought that was a nice marriage. And then the other element to walk away with is we need to be explicit about this as educators. We need to be very explicit with our future educators about what we're doing so that they understand what we're modeling, et cetera. And I really appreciate that theme. So realizing our examples were in respect to oftentimes future special educators, future general educators. I'm wondering with our stakeholders with CIDDL, early childhood, our related service colleagues, as well as our future leaders, which I know many of us are engaged with as well. When we consider different stakeholders, are there different things to think about within the framework? And I'll add in another element asked from our colleagues out there in the chat land, and that is, what if we are preparing them for potentially more of a hybrid virtual environment? Are there other considerations within the framework and what you might do or what you are doing? And we only have a few minutes for this one, folks, but I'll let whoever wants to start on this one. Jamie, Jamie, we haven't heard from you. So why don't you get started on this one, Jamie? Nothing like putting you on the spot.
Thanks for putting me on the spot. Well, like I said earlier, I think the first thing I would do is start with the notion of accessibility and making sure no matter what environment we're in, things are accessible, right? And accessible for the students you're teaching. And we have to understand accessibility and have our students understand accessibility from the students they're going to be encountering. And so that's a very sort of base level sort of consideration, because to me, that's the starting line for UDL, right? And Sean, you and I always talk about this. We've talked about this for many, many years, but UDL moves well beyond accessibility. So if something's not accessible, you're not even at the starting line. The idea that you need to get past the starting line and really think about, how are you really building understanding, and how are you actually using and leveraging evidence-based practices, high leverage practices in that sort of work. And then how are we then marrying that into the assessments into the goals, as to what Kavita was saying earlier, of the learning environment, and really think deeply around not just the environment but the individual experiences the students are having from accessibility through developing that sort of deep, more internalized understanding of what it means to take on executive functioning and deal with establishing your own goals when or helping students facilitate their goals, et cetera. So and really the environment of itself shouldn't matter, other than we're looking at the different tools and the different strategies that you would use in the different environments. And that's where I would think the difference lies, is, because there is a way you're going to teach different in a completely virtualized environment than you are in a physical environment, but it's how we're utilizing those tools more deeply. And that's what CIDDL's going to have to do some focus on I think that's true. So I know we're almost out of time. I don't want
And,
to be
and,
last
and
minute.
just FYI, and we'll put this out as a resource before I forget, in collaboration with CIDDL, there's an affinity group. Our first virtual interaction will be November 10th at 1 o'clock Central Time. And we'll put this out in news. We're talking in respect to that teacher preparation, respect to hybrid and virtual environments. So just a little pitch there, and we'll put that out as a resource. But we do have still a couple more minutes. Anyone want to take that in terms of various stakeholders and other considerations there and our broader stakeholders in terms of preparation?
So Shauna, I'd just like to add that I find it much more challenging to make a connection and get to know my students well when it's only in an online environment. And so I want to put in a little plug for our Mighty Networks that we will have rolling out next week at the TED conference. So we will have a CIDDL-based Mighty Network starting next week, and that will allow us to establish groups where we can get together and get to know each other better and learn more about what each other's doing.
I'll jump in for your question, Sean. And I really firmly believe that if you're designing, you can design for different levels, environments. If you know the process, it's UDL doesn't change. You just design for the goal of whatever you're doing. So that's my quick answer to that. But I just also want to add one thing that I emphasize to teachers when I teach about UDL. You don't have to do it all. Start small. If you add a little bit of flexibility, you're already winning. So sometimes people get alarmed. They look at this big framework. They're like, am I supposed to do all of this? Absolutely not. That would be chaos. So pick something, make it more flexible, and you'll be amazed how the flexibility just keeps building. So that's an important thing to convey if you are somebody teaching teachers or related service providers about UDL.
And folks, I had a bit of I couldn't find my mute button to unmute, but I wanted to share, as Matt was saying, the CIDDL communities. Here's information on the CIDDL communities that we wanted to share with you, that we're getting these communities of practice starting up, and we're already having folks joining. And as Matt mentioned, we'll be in Fort Worth, Texas next week for the Council for Exceptional Children's Teacher Education Division Conference, where we'll be doing a session including this type of focus. So I wanted to make reference to that as we're closing things out. Very poor transition on my part, I apologize. But I want to thank the wonderful panelists for being here, for sharing their insight. We have recorded this. You will get a link out in the next, like I said, 24 to 48 hours, give us a day or two, that will include some resources that have been referred to, as well as additional resources, information about this webinar, as well as ways to contact our wonderful guest presenters and ways to come and visit them directly in Hattiesburg or, well, I think we all go to Honolulu first and visit Kavita. But anyways, I want to go observe all you guys in action. Fortunately, I'm a colleague of Jamie, so I can go into his classroom. So with that, thank you again, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and we will share this information out very shortly. So thank you.